All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming here on a Friday afternoon at the end of the conference. We'll try and keep you awake, keep you entertained, and also try and keep this moving so we can get you out of here on time. This panel is on tech deregulation, both in the US and abroad, and how the US big tech industry and lobby is really pushing a lot of their influence on various policymakers and whether or not that has extended outside of the US. So we have some incredible speakers here, both from the US with Callie, as well as a lot of different EU and UK representatives. So we're very excited to hear from everyone on what they're seeing in terms of deregulation, what are the influences, and what are the major stakeholders behind everything. So first I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, then I'm going to go kind of down the line with some questions about what they're seeing on their specific corner of the policy world, and then I'm going to open it up for the last 30 minutes or so to be able to talk with all the other experts in the room. Like, everyone here has there's so much in this brain trust at CPDP that we would love to hear from you all what you're thinking and like what questions you have for us. So with that, I'll hand it over. We can go down the line, 2 to 3 minutes explanation of who you are, what you do, and how you've been seeing deregulation at a very high level. 2 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes, just like a very high level of like how it's been affecting your part of the industry.
Me?
You want to go ahead and start?
Hello everybody. I'm Alexandra Gese. I'm a member of the European Parliament from the Greens. I work on digital matters. I was negotiator of the Digital Services Act and followed a little bit all the other things. And I'm a co-founder of the Eurostack movement, trying to promote technological sovereignty in Europe. Where is this deregulatory effect coming from the US affecting me? Well, first of all, very simply, DSA enforcement is basically not happening. We could have done really, really great things with the DSA. We were all so hopeful when we worked on it in the past mandate and with Commissioner Breton, the Commission doing great things. We have a good piece of legislation and basically nothing is happening. The Commission is saying, well, we do this and we do that and we did something on X and we do something a little bit on TikTok. But the really big things that we could be doing, they're absolutely not happening. And we know this is because of the pressure coming from the US. Definitely seeing it in AI, the fact that there was an AI omnibus, so that the AI Act, rather than being enforced, was being reopened and was still, we stopped negotiating it. We finished now the AI omnibus. The same thing on data, so discussing GDPR. It's a really big impact, and rather than going forward and enforcing what we decided, we are opening it, we're trying to defend at least the spirit of it, and nothing is happening in terms of enforcement. And the worst thing I think now, but maybe not the worst, is now the US-EU dialogue on digital policy, on DSA, DMA enforcement. It's basically asking, the tech companies to come in and grade their own homework. And I keep saying, well, this is the very definition of foreign influence. And there's all this talk around FEMI. I think you're all more or less experts in the room. So if I use jargon that is not clear, let me know. Around foreign influence is the EU democracy shield. And then you ask a foreign government and the same companies that are being regulated to come and sit in the room and decide how we're going to regulate them. This is simply ridiculous. So I think the impact is really, really big. The whole simplification narrative that also comes from the industry, not only from the US, it also in part comes from European industry, but it's extremely powerful and it's keeping us from doing our work.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tommaso.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. My name is Tommaso Falchetta. I'm a Global Advocacy Coordinator for Privacy International. If you don't know Privacy International, we are based in the UK, but we are an international organization working closely with partners around the world on issues related to technologies and human rights. We have particular focus and expertise on privacy and data protection, but we see also, other how it affects other rights and more broadly society. And I think, moving from the European perspective to more broadly, and as I mentioned, we work quite closely with civil society organizations in other parts of the world. We see this deregulation affecting those jurisdictions as well. We'll talk a little bit more and give a couple of examples later on. But the overall impression is that on one side, you have the US really moving forward very aggressively with a sort of new way of dealing with the trade policies and tariffs to change sort of the terms of digital policies in various countries. And on the other hand, you have the EU that seems to have kind of well, it's not yet given in, but it's definitely kind of moving in the direction of talking about simplification, which actually is a form of deregulation in some of the contexts that we are particularly concerned about, including the EU digital omnibus. And this stance of the EU is actually weakening also the capacity of civil society actors across the world to actually push for a more progressive agenda in terms of regulating technologies and in particular big tech. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Veal. I'm Professor of Technology Law and Policy at University College London. So, yeah, as mentioned, I'm from the UK. It's a small island off the coast of the Netherlands. Sort of varyingly small, depending on the day. I'm not sure I'm a representative of the UK. They wouldn't hold me out as that, I think. But certainly, I've been observing what's been happening there and elsewhere. We see, and we'll obviously talk more in substance later on, but we see probably two kind of broad effects from the US in multiple dimensions. Some of it directly comes from deregulation as a word, but also just direct pressure in the UK particularly. So that happens in sort of proto-legislation moment as people work out what to put on the agenda, because of course after Brexit, we sort of split just before the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act was passed. And the way that Brexit works, for those of you who have not been avidly following the thrills, is that any sort of law or piece of European case law that comes after the end of 2020 is not on the UK books. And anything before, or was commenced before, was. So we have still got GDPR in very much the same form and so on, but we then moved the Online Safety Act instead of the DSA. We kind of have some digital markets regulation, but it's not as sort of explicitly laid out. So, but when we're thinking about AI, that's been stalled very heavily, largely from US pressure, attempts to make AI bills. We can talk about the sort of details of how that's been stalled internally in government. And then there's the interpretation of our existing legal rule book, and people have become much more hesitant on that interpretation, I would say. And then there's enforcement strategies of regulators. These do differ across the piece, but certainly I think the appetites of Ofcom and the Competition and Markets Authority have been dampened in different ways. The Information Commissioner's Office, their appetite for regulatory action has been always mixed. I don't think they've been so directly affected, perhaps, by the US approach. The last thing I'll say before we can do more comments later on is this differs across sectors as well. I think in the law enforcement area, the effect has been quite less clear. In intelligence as well. I think there is a competition with the US, and that can involve more regulation and more powers, of course. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. And in the Online Safety Act platform regulation area, it was quite slow, which many people thought was a good thing because the Online Safety Act is not the best drafted piece of legislation. But after the Grok kind of nudification scandal in late December, the political winds really got behind it. And Ofcom now, I think, feels like it has a lot of political backing to be more firm, at least on those issues. So it is kind of plus échange with children and children's issues, particularly driving the agenda and being able to cut through, but other things sort of falling a bit by the wayside.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm so sorry for the diatribe you're about to give, but what is going on in the US?
Hi.
Are you a representative of the US?
I am the US representative. Obviously, I'm a huge fan. My name is Callie Schrader. I work for the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is a civil society organization in the US. We work on privacy and human rights issues. And I run the international policy and the AI and human rights programs there. So I get to come at this from the perspective of let's look at how extensive the deregulatory agenda has been in the US. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it's affected every single part of our government and our legal system. So I'll go through a few different levels here. Number one, we can see it at a federal level because many of the previous agencies and enforcement bodies that we used to work with either have been completely dismantled so they're non-functional, or they flatly no longer exist. So the CFPB, which was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, doesn't exist anymore. It is completely gone. They fired everyone that was part of that, and the agency is dead. The Federal Trade Commission, which is in charge of most of consumer protection in the US at the federal level, usually is supposed to have 5 commissioners on it. It has 2, and Trump is refusing to appoint more, so they cannot form a quorum, and you cannot open investigations or do enforcement actions without a quorum. You have to have at least 3 commissioners to have a quorum. There are many other agencies that have been given explicit instructions that they are not to pursue certain agendas, they are not to open certain investigations, and they are carrying that out. And in general, I'm unfortunately sure that you're all aware of how dysfunctional our Congress is, so there's not a lot of hope for federal laws being passed to regulate in these spaces either. And then at the state level, because the federal level has not been functional, states have been much more active in trying to pass laws. And in many ways, this is a good thing. But because the states are the active area that we're seeing in the US, we are seeing open tech involvement and input into these forums. So we work quite a lot in going to hearings and trying to propose good bills, propose updates to bills, make them a little bit stronger. What we're seeing is the tech industry has effectuated a very effective system in the US at the state level where they will write out arguments for how to make laws weaker or how to try and defeat laws that would do consumer protection or tech protections. And they will hand those to local organizations who will then present it as if these are their own ideas. So the talking points are fully written by like Meta, Google, Amazon. They're handing them to local industries. Those industries are then reading them out at hearings. And the lawmakers are believing that this is representative of state interests instead of big tech interests. This is a very hard thing for us to challenge, both because of the money that is backing it and because there are massive teams of lawyers at these companies that have many more resources than we do. So it's very challenging to counter those narratives and to prove that this is coming from big tech and not from local groups. The other area that we're seeing this is in some venues that haven't traditionally been used for deregulation, at least in the US, but is happening quite a lot now. So for deregulation, we're both seeing that laws are simply not getting passed or not getting enforced. We are also seeing the Trump administration has twice introduced what is called the AI moratorium, which is a federal law that the second time they tried to introduce it into a budget act, the big, beautiful bill. I will quibble with the title later. It's very stupid. But they introduced an amendment to that, which would put a 10-year moratorium on states being able to pass or enforce existing laws that regulate AI. So for 10 years, they would not be able to pass any laws that regulate AI and would not be able to enforce any laws that regulate AI. The justification for this is that it would allow for a long period of innovation. I don't know why they have so little faith in tech people that they're unable to innovate if there's any laws in place. But they have tried this twice. The second time, it was so unpopular and the pushback was so fierce that Ted Cruz, who introduced the amendment, voted against his own amendment. So it has not passed either time, but it is still an active thing. Most recently, Trump tried to pass an executive order that would do the same thing. Fortunately for us, executive orders do not have the power to override state laws. So hasn't found a way to do it yet, is still trying to do it. There are also trade agreements in which they're trying to bully a lot of other countries into weakening their own laws so that US tech companies are able to expand more broadly and don't have to follow any consumer protection laws. There are contract agreements that they're trying to get this to happen under as well, international contracts. And when those avenues don't work, there is just a lot of public and press bullying. So, for example, in Congress, there have been Congress members that have talked about EU simplification and the proposal for simplification. And the entire framing of that is that the EU has acknowledged that its laws are bad, and so it's weakening them because we were right, and it's a bad idea to have these kinds of privacy and consumer protection laws. Obviously, we know that is hopefully not accurate, not the case, but that is how the US frames it, and because the vast majority of the American public is not tracking how laws in other countries are being enforced and how they're being developed and how they're being applied, most Americans believe that that's the case. And that is a really concerning thing when it comes to public pressure and public policy. The very last thing, I'm sorry, I'm already monopolizing this. The very last thing is that there's a level of direct tech input into the federal government that we have not seen in previous administrations. We've always known the tech industry lobbies very hard, tries to make a lot of connections with governance, and tends to be relatively successful, but there's always been something of a barrier. There is not anymore. Elon Musk was actively involved in dismantling the federal government. He was not appointed to a position and could not pass security and clearance checks that he was mandated to do, which is why he never formally had a position, was just given access to a bunch of government information. Sam Altman frequently visits the White House and is in direct conversation with Trump all the time. OpenAI is developing a government-specific product and is in active talks and has a lot of access to government data that way as well. Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, a lot of the big tech guys, we see them going in and out of the White House constantly. They have open access to our administration, and there have been a lot of public and not public deals with Trump and his family where he is being personally enriched by giving access to these tech companies. So, personal opinion, I just think now the new method for deregulation is open corruption. But on that cheery note, back to the other panelists.
As you can see, this really is an effort that's from the very top to the bottom, really digging into the different policy spheres, like worldwide at this point. Not to continue hammering down on Callie, but I think another thing that is an important part of the piece of this puzzle is the litigation aspect of it in the United States. And a lot of the legislation that we do have on the books, the bills that have passed at the state level, they're all being challenged and stopped by the big tech lobby, the Big Five. Callie, could you talk a little bit about how that's going and how Epic is involved in that?
We're back. So on the litigation front, yes, there's a few different ways that's been happening. Number one, some of the agencies that are no longer active had enforcement actions or agreements or open investigations against tech companies. And when the administration shifted, not only did they cease any active investigations and cases against big tech companies, they actually went back into previous consent orders that had been finalized and reversed them. So like Lena Khan used to lead the Federal Trade Commission. She had many active actions against Meta, against Google, against the large tech companies. Had come to agreements with them, consent agreements for where they would change their practices and there would be checks on that. And Ferguson, who is the current commissioner, went into those signed agreements and invalidated them and just told the tech companies that those were no longer valid and they did not have to follow those orders anymore. So many years of work got wiped out, which is very unfortunate. At the state level, there are still a lot of active lawsuits that are trying to enforce consumer protections, frequently by attorneys general, who are the people at the states that have Federal Trade Commission level authority to be able to bring consumer protection actions. And that is a challenge in many ways. Number one, because the federal government is cutting a lot of funding that goes to states from the federal government, so they have fewer resources to bring these cases. And number two, because the tech companies have tons of resources to be able to appeal and appeal and appeal and wear out states so that it's very hard to enforce in these systems. Sometimes attorneys general are creative and they will band together groups of like 30 to 40 attorneys general that all bring a suit together so they can pool resources. That has been fairly effective, but you have to actually get them all to agree on what they're suing over and what they would like in those lawsuits, which is very challenging. There's been a lot of active lawsuits from civil society where previously we had focused a lot on policy. We still do, but we focus a lot more on lawsuits lately than we did previously. I can say just from personal experience, Epic used to have a much smaller team that worked on litigation. All of us have worked on a case in the past 2 years. And that is a new development, but it is also one of the only avenues we've found where you can still actively fight for consumer protections. So the landscape of that has shifted quite a bit. And it's also very hard when many of the laws that we would base lawsuits on keep changing as we're in the middle of filing lawsuits.
Absolutely. And I think that's just really indicative of like trying to figure out what levers you have available to you to continue the work that has really been put in, like the years and years of effort. Like with a DSA and DMA and digital package in the EU, like with the UK, like all these different pieces that are just like being eroded as like right in front of our eyes. So this one is for Alexandra and maybe Michael. Could you talk a little bit about how enforcement is being stalled in laws, or how enforcement is being stalled on laws that are already in effect? You mentioned the DSA. Any kind of AI regulation is really stopped in the UK as well. Kind of what does that look like? What has the influence been, and like what has been your experience going through this process after so many years of trying to get this in the first place?
Yeah. Well, on the DSA, we see a lot less enforcement action than we would like to see. Then we do see enforcement action on smaller details that are important and they are in the legislation, like the transparency of advertising archives. So it's something we fought for. We're happy to have them. And it's good that the Commission is investigating that. But it's very clear that the problems we're having right now are so much bigger. And just to give you a couple of examples, since you mentioned the Nudify apps and the Grok case, that started at the end of 2025. It went into 2026. The EU didn't do anything. This is clearly illegal content. The content of women that's illegal. Sexualized images of women against their will, it's illegal in most member states. Child sexual abuse material is highly criminal all over the European Union. And it took the Commission some time, 3 weeks, I think, to come up with an investigation. Then the technical level of the Commission, which is very, very good, the DSA enforcement team, had this investigation ready on a Monday morning. They wanted to announce that was a Davos week. And the German press reported that Ursula von der Leyen personally stopped it, because Trump was sent to speak in Davos, and they don't want to annoy him because it was about Greenland and so on. So, I mean, it's this kind of level of intervention that they get a call from Washington and the highest level stops the investigation that the Commission is already working on that's ready to go. So it took one more week, and then they launched it the Monday afterwards. Anybody heard about results? I mean, that's not a complicated investigation. I know this is a little bit exaggerating, but I mean, you take 2 dozen of screenshots and you have your evidence. What is it that you have to do? I realize it's a little bit more complicated if you build a legal case, but it's not that complicated. And I mean, in the UK, they jumped on it because they saw, this is so obvious. It creates so much outrage. It's such an easy case. If you can't even act on a case like that, what are you doing? The other case that really outrages me is the TikTok case and Romania. You remember Romania had a presidential election where a person who was like polling at 1% in the beginning of the campaign ended up winning. And then the Romanian intelligence services found out there had been huge TikTok campaigns, huge influencer campaigns with millions and millions of funding that had not been declared through these influencers. And TikTok basically not only had not discovered these huge bot networks that were working there, but had also labeled all other candidates as political content, and political content on TikTok in theory gets downranked. At least mine does. That's what they're saying. They don't want political content, so it gets downranked. But they did not label this far-right candidate who ended up winning the election. So his engagement, his visibility was enhanced by the influencers and the bot networks, and it was not dimmed or censored by TikTok like the other political accounts. And therefore, Romania annulled these elections. Then the European Commission, who's competent, because the Romanian enforcer can't do that on their own because they're not competent, because it's TikTok, it's VLOP, and they repeated the election 6 months later. The investigation is still open, and it's never been closed. And every time I ask the commissioner, so what's up with the TikTok investigation? Yeah, we're working on it. It's going to come soon. It's going to come soon. It's like 2 years. It's going to come soon. And people in the country are completely losing faith in democracy, because if you cancel an election and then you can come up with the evidence why you did that, because it's the European Commission's competence to provide that, What are people supposed to believe? Half of the people now believe it was totally illegal to cancel that election. That's just two examples, but I think these two examples are very clear, very easy to understand. And from what I'm hearing, and this is really doing damage to democracy and to the faith. And in Germany, for example, people are saying, well, the DSA is not doing anything. So it's really taking away people's faith in democracy and people's faith in democracy being able to accomplish things, to deliver. And people feel extremely frustrated and feel they don't have agency. And I think that is a very, very dangerous thing, together with the algorithm pushing extremist parties, also creating this feeling, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, we could do it, they're just not doing it for political choice.
So on my island, there was a little institute initially called the AI Safety Institute. And it was one of the first AI safety institutes. It was set up as an attempt by our former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to return to California to get a job after he would be removed from office. He had to, when he was Chancellor, he had to give up his green card because the green card condition is you will eventually come and, you must be permanent resident or you must continue to reside in the US. And people thought maybe that was slightly incompatible with high office in a different country. But Sunak, the context is that by far and away the richest Prime Minister that the UK has ever had in history. Anyway, so he set up this AI Safety Institute with this Bletchley Park meeting, and the US one was set up simultaneously. And under more preemptive pressure from the Trump administration, they swapped the name very quickly after Trump's election to the AI Security Institute, because they were worried that safety would be out of fashion. Now, actually, the US maintained its name for a while longer as AI Safety Institute. It has now sort of been all stripped and turned into something entirely different. The name I forget, but it sounds a bit like NIST, but it's not NIST.
Probably as smart as the Department of War.
Yeah. Now, why is this story interesting? Well, firstly, there's a reframing. Even the AI safety framing was already very heavily captured by sort of US philanthropic interests, the kind of effective altruist approach, and the kind of long-termist view of AI issues. Security then reframes it in a slightly different way. And there's an interesting dynamic that I think is quite telling that's been happening inside this organization too. So there were promises that this organization would get a statutory footing. So it would be a body established in law. In a common law system, you don't need to do as much passing of law to create a new public body as you do in some civil law systems. So it was sort of set up as a part of another government department, with a renamed thing. It's not a real legal entity at the moment. This, with higher salaries and various other stuff, you can still be quite flexible. So this is set up this way. But it had no power to demand anything of the big AI laboratories and so on, yet it was trying to act as an auditor. It has been increasingly captured by the AI laboratories being much less afraid of reputational risk, refusing access, refusing publication of things, and the result of this has been a massive chilling effect within this organization of the kind of work that they do, because they now refuse to do any kind of work, including internally, resisting many parts of high up in the organization, resisting doing any work on child sexual abuse or violence against women because the labs don't want them to do it. And this kind of complete fear, because it's entirely based on the noblesse oblige situation they have with the big labs, is very chilling, even of a body with no enforcement power, but one that was promised enforcement power. So then last December, after many journeys internally, a law that was about AI, with kind of the UK's AI Act, which would never have been like the EU's AI Act, but was taken through hundreds of iterations internally and eventually never even put in front of Parliament. So it was killed by number 10 last December. And by that time, it had already been watered down, I think, into the AI innovation bill internally and had but even that was too much. And we're seeing the phone calls happen exactly in the same way in a variety of reasons, in a variety of ways. So the government in the UK also wanted to give a contract, and they think they did in the end, to Rolls-Royce for sort of small nuclear power generation tools for AI centers, which, you may think is silly enough, but the story that I've also heard behind the scenes of this is that the US called up and said, you cannot do this, you must give it to one of the AI companies instead, this contract. Which these companies have, Rolls-Royce has a track record of making at least physical things, and the UK government just about resisted this. Because I thought, well, so we're at this stage of I think coming to what you're saying, Kai, as well. It's very and also what you're saying as well, Alexandra. We were this very micro level of meddling that comes both internally in a chilling effect world, but also from just the US picking up the phone.
Yeah.
And I think that's a new thing. So deregulation is this micro level intervention, micromanagement, which I think is how it emerges quite a lot.
Horrifying. From this micromanagement perspective, we've seen things like enforcement of existing laws going on, but also a lot of change in the soft power between the US and the EU. Tommaso, from your perspective, how have you seen things change on the trade, the tariffs, on everything, especially like as the Trump administration has gone on? It's been about a year and a half of everything. And so I know there were a lot of EU government officials who thought that if we go into this with compromise and appeasement, then maybe we can come to a solution that works for everybody. Is that still the case, and how would that really work with the Trump administration?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to broaden it a little bit beyond the EU, UK, and the US. And I think I would like to make two broad points. One is that, generally speaking, there is evidence that with the new Trump administration, it's much harder for countries to resist the pressure of the US and the big tech to move forward for regulation. There is definitely evidence of that. If you look back just before Trump, the UN Trade and Development body issued a report, and they look at kind of how digital legislation were moving across countries beyond the EU. So they found that obviously the EU was leading in many ways, but even in Asia, in Latin America, in other countries, in other regions, there was significant movement, particularly around this issue of restoring competition in digital markets. I think there was a recognition, that something needed to be done, and then things sort of stopped. Or at least that's the impression. And I'll give you two examples. They're not necessarily related to each other, but I think they sort of represent a trend. But the second point I want to make more broadly is that I think what the US administration is because of the stance of the US administration, it's opening up the space for other actors that are also opposing regulation to actually have much more power and much more capacity to carry their deregulatory agenda or stopping regulation from taking forward. So I'll give an example. In India, there was a proposed digital competition bill, which I think is now been abandoned. I mean, if there are people here that have more information about it, I would be interested to hear. It was heralded when it was first introduced as a sort of moving toward ex-ante regulation of digital markets, something that we know in the EU. Yes, big tech company oppose it, but also quite a few of the domestic companies that were leaders in some of the sectors that would have been affected by this bill oppose it, and I think they found a good way to kind of basically reaching the situation where it's not moving, which actually also prove another point, which is these regulations that are they are not aimed only at the US big tech. And the second point, the second example I want to give is Brazil. I think it's more complicated there. Unlike other countries in the region, I don't think they have signed a trade agreement or pledged some sort of non-discriminatory treatment for US companies. They are under a lot of pressure. Some of the bills that were aimed to regulate the digital space, including AI, I think they are losing legislative momentum. At the same time, I've heard recently that the regulation of the digital markets bills seem to be moving forward. There was a decision recently by by Parliament to allow the bill to proceed in a sort of expedited way. Again, if there are experts from Brazil who know more, please, come forward. And again, the bill would establish sort of ex-ante regulation and allow the competition authority there to designate large firms, impose tailored obligation, etc., etc. So now, will this bill be passed? I mean, as I said, there is this kind of attempt to push it forward. At the same time, there are elections this year, so maybe it's not going to be able to pass before election take place. So just to get back to your question, I think there are many forces at play that want to push against regulation and push for deregulation domestically and internationally. And I think, each country has its own internal dynamics, and the US is definitely kind of playing a significant part in pushing this deregulation agenda at the moment. But, going back to the point I was making at the beginning, I think it doesn't help if the EU is also weakening its regulatory framework. It really doesn't help these countries to push forward the way they want. They basically find very difficult to find allies at international level. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really telling, this global effect that's going on, and like the change, really a seismic shift in how tech policy is going forward. And it's very troubling to see this. You mentioned a couple of global examples, Tommaso. Have we seen any at the member state level, or any global countries that have been pushing for more regulation in light of this deregulatory effort? And this can be for any of you.
So I guess while it's not, it depends on which area you want to choose. There's been let's talk about, it's not a positive answer to your question, but in national security fields, there has been a push, and it's also clashed with the US. So in the United Kingdom, we had amendments that were made to the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, which was a sort of post-Snowden improvement and more clarification of the national security laws that related to interception and similar kinds of things. And this concerned you might have seen the Apple Advanced Data Protection saga. So on Apple phones, it's possible to turn on a feature called Advanced Data Protection. In classic Apple way, it doesn't have anything to do with data protection. It's just them redefining the word. But what it is effectively end-to-end encryption of storage on iCloud. And if you're in the national security sort of student of it, a domain, you're paying attention to that kind of thing, you'll know that this was always kind of the way in which the US got access to the information, because people backed up things to iCloud, and therefore they could get access for quite a long time to things like WhatsApp messages and so on. And Apple sort of didn't close that for various kinds of political, but also user interface and usability reasons. So they added in this end-to-end encryption. It was an optional feature. And the UK made an order to have them turn it off. Apple leaked that order to the Washington Post. And the interesting saga that happened with civil society in the UK is we were saved in the end by, I think, Pam Bondi, because it then effectively turned that this would go onto the desk of the US, and they thought that it was then surveying Americans, and they sort of blown this up. It's still ongoing in mostly secret courts in England and in the UK. However, this was a real clash, and there were some uncomfortable friends to be made, where you say, actually, this attempt to, we need to ally with the US against the UK in this context. And so this was an example, but I feel like in the security domain, similar to sort of CSAM scanning and domain, things charge ahead, and the US is strangely at sometimes a helpful ally for some civil society, but you have to, when you're playing with fire, you have to be careful.
No, I think the striking example where there is demand for more regulation is the social media ban for kids, where there is basically an international convergence on the fact that kids should not be on social media in their current form. I think it's a very double-edged sword because on the one hand, it's a chance, and some of the NGOs campaigning around it said, well, it's important so we can explain people the harms of addictive design, of toxic algorithms, of use of data, micro-targeting, and so on, and then we get rid of the whole thing. I don't think that perfectly worked out. I think it worked out 50% because you still have the talking point about why are these platforms so bad, but it's more going towards some kind of ban on social media ban for kids in different ages. So it also could go in the way of building like a global surveillance structure if you allow the companies to use biometric data. I think it can still go both ways, being bad or not bad. But I think that is interesting because people are really openly talking about the harms and asking for more regulation. So I think that is really the one thing. The other thing that I found out like in the past weeks, and I've been talking about last week, and that gets a lot of interest, is how much US citizens are set against artificial intelligence and calling for regulation. I think the numbers are absolutely staggering. If you look at the chart of the world in America, it's in the US, it's 70% or more than 70% of US citizens are saying that are a lot more concerned with the lack and the incapacity of the federal government to pass regulation than with possible risks being linked to the regulation. 7 out of 10 Americans are against data centers and so on. I mean, the numbers are the young and highly educated people don't get jobs anymore, very clearly against AI, a lot more than in Europe. And the numbers really show that. So I think this is a story, we talked about narratives before, we have to tell in Europe saying, well, yeah, but in America, because, you know, what we are told the whole time, because the only people who get to talk to policymakers are tech CEOs and their lobbyists and the government, you know, normal people don't get access. So the story is all you are failing because you have all that regulation, which everybody in the innovation environment knows it's not true. It's a lack of capital, but you know that's another narrative problem. But I think bringing this narrative saying, well, yeah, but people in the US, you can't build a data center anymore because people will show up and demonstrate against it physically. People won't re-elect you if you have data centers built, if you're in favor of the AI companies. I mean, that's relevant for politicians. And it's the lack of regulation that's riling people up because the impact is so bad and people are saying, no, it's not good. It's not good. It's not innovation. It's not making my life better. It's making my life worse. And I think this is a story we need to tell here in Europe and saying, well, maybe with a more, you know, reasonable approach where we actually protect people from the dangers and we make sure that AI actually serves the people and not a handful of billionaires, we can have a much better environment for everybody and do this in a reasonable way. I think this is really a change of narrative that I've started doing since I figured this out. And I think that is something we could do to push for. I mean, we have the regulation at least to start enforcing what we have and then maybe come up with something better.
Yeah, to build on that point a little bit. So I cover 2 areas at EPIC. I cover international policy and I cover AI and human rights. They converge quite a lot. There's a lot of international conversation about AI. But because of the AI part of my role, I do study quite a lot the public sentiment and what the pushbacks are on AI. We do a lot of work specifically looking at the risks of AI and pointing out where they are and why they're developing that way. And some of this is personal opinion. It is backed by research, but it is my interpretation of it. So I'll preface. I think so much of the U.S. pushback to AI is based on several factors that Europeans don't feel in the same way because Europe, in many cases, has a lot more social safety nets than the U.S. does. Like we do not have the same healthcare, pension, rent, food access that a lot of Europeans do. And so we're also, because so many of the large tech companies that are developing AI are based in the US citizens are being used as test subjects and guinea pigs in a lot of these cases. And so we're seeing a lot of the very worst effects of it. So we are seeing a huge crash in the labor market. It is a very serious problem. We are seeing devastating effects on children. There have been now I have to use, it goes beyond both fingers, the number of suicides that have been affected by chatbots directly telling children how to kill themselves or encouraging them to do so. Like it is not a tangential thing. It is, in one of the cases, the child that was talking to the chatbot that he had been encouraged to use for school and then it expanded. He said that he was going to leave his noose out so his mother would talk to him about it, and the chatbot told him not to and offered to write his suicide note. It's really, really bad. What we are seeing in a regulatory context is it's very hard to pass broad laws in the US. We are having a lot of success passing very specific laws. So Epic wrote a model chatbot bill about children's safety and how you need to design chatbots so that they can be more safe. It's been introduced into 8 different states. 5 of those are Republican. It's a bipartisan issue that people really care about safety in these matters. We're having a lot of success in passing laws about how AI can be used in labor and employment. So whether or not it can be used to review resumes or to review applications or to decide on bonuses or whether someone is fired. There's been a really strong pushback on use of AI in the criminal justice system because there are AI things that are being used for sentencing recommendations, and that is affecting people's freedom. It's a very serious issue. So with a lot of this, part of, I think, why there's such a huge difference between US sentiment and EU sentiment, like I as an American, was very surprised at some of the panels I went to because as a whole, Europeans in general have been so much more optimistic about AI use than we are, and it's because we see so many of the worst systems. As a final note, and then I will turn it back over, we do get asked quite a lot because civil society often is like the doom and gloom group that is pointing out all of the ways things are terrible. So we do get asked sometimes if we think there's any good potential for AI. I do think there are ways to build safe AI systems. I just think that US companies have no interest in doing that because it would cost money and it would slow down their revenue generation. And right now, AI companies are all about speed, power, and access. And so anything safety related that would slow down that speed or force them to consider the risks that they are causing right now and realign or readapt their systems for that, they are extremely resistant to. And that includes things like, in many of the generative AI systems, you could not exercise your rights in the way that they're currently constructed, because if personal data is in a training data set and you ask it to be removed from that training data set, the way that generative AI is built, you would have to scrap the algorithm that was built on that and then retrain it from the updated set. That costs time and money, and they don't want to do that. So just from my perspective, I think that's one of the shifts in approach that we're seeing in different places.
I made an error in my remark, which is it wasn't Pam Bondi, it was Chelsea Gabbard. So, so I just kind of realized I misspoke. So yeah, when
Both bad.
Again, horrifying. I think we've heard a lot of different things on a lot of different topics. I do want to leave a lot of time for questions from the audience, so I do want to open it up for anyone who has any questions. I already see one, so you can go ahead and open up. We can take a couple and then we can go ahead and answer them.
Hi, I'm Helena. Actually, I have 3 questions. First,
Get the pens ready.
as someone who was raised in America under the pumpkin administration, that was a good time in California. So I was I was in San Francisco and I was in DC for the past years, and for the past years I have noticed that there are a lot of tensions between the East Coast and the West Coast, California and DC, of course, right? But also there are a lot of like tensions even within the Republican Party in DC, and people have realized that, Trump basically destroyed the crypto market, right? So, and you mentioned, Kelly mentioned that there are a lot of like tech CEOs, they're like, voting against their, the amendment. So, and with the midterm election coming closer, do you think that the tensions, these tensions would force the American government, the federal level to, shift into probably not that anti-deregulatory approach in terms of AI regulation? And second question, as a solicitor in England, Wales, and someone did most medication, PhD and master in the UK, I wanted to ask, Michael, right? Yeah. It's like, do you think that currently, I think the special relationship between America and the UK has been, has been like a one-way ticket. I'm afraid that it's going to be like a no-way ticket, zero-way ticket in the future. Do you think that the UK is going to shifting towards EU or America, in the future, because as we are law teachers in the UK, so we stopped teaching EU law, probably from since 2023. I think in Bristol, but I'm not sure whether that's the case. And third question is for everyone. It's like as a Chinese citizen and a Chinese lawyer, I wanted to say that I think everyone has realized that the Chinese approach, in terms of AI regulation, has become like new, right? And it has been learning from the EU approach, and it already had similar thing like right to explanation in Personal Information Protection Act, and with the basically as the anti-America movement. In China has been doing basically the opposite of everything that America has been doing. And do you think that in this xenophobia era, everyone hates us. So do you think this is going to be one of the main reasons that why, probably the factor that is going to encourage America to move a little bit, further towards a pro-regulation approach, just to make sure that, everyone hates China as a bogeyman? Okay, that's all.
I think
my
we'll
question.
pause there and kind of take those questions in turn. Thank you so much. Maybe Callie to start on the East-West Coast and midterms question.
Yay. So in the US, I'm based in Colorado, so I'm in the middle of the country. And I do see a lot of that competition and tension. Typically, it does fall along deciding very interesting cultural splits, as well as a lot of the tech industry is based on the West Coast, and a lot of the regulatory industry is based on the East Coast, and they do not get along a lot of the time. I think that dynamic is a really interesting one. I think in general, it's not even that dynamic that's going to cause a lot of tensions and shifts in the midterms. What's going to cause a lot of shifts is that Trump has been so self-serving and transparently corrupt in this administration beyond, it's the end of the day on a Friday. He also has dementia and is falling apart, and was never a good person or a smart person. But because he has pushed so hard for his own self-interest and has completely abandoned maintaining any of the strength of his party, a lot of Republican representatives are extremely frustrated with him. He's endangering their seats and their reelection because of the things he's insisting they support that are wildly unpopular with their bases. The last poll that I saw, he has scored lower in the popular approval vote than any president in history since we started taking presidential approval polls. That's a really, really serious thing. And so I think there is definitely likely to be, there's been a huge shift in American public perception of Trump and support for Trump. There's been real schisms within the Republican Party. It's very hard because Trump keeps very tight control of his party, and it retaliates pretty brutally when people question him. So there hasn't been a lot of pushback. There is becoming much more pushback. Those people are getting the same treatment, but they're still doing it, which I think shows the level of upset and disapproval that's happening there. If they manage to not completely screw up the voting maps and the voting system, there should be a pretty large shift in the midterm elections. But we're kind of waiting to see exactly how that plays out. But I do think that a shift is coming. I'll very briefly touch on the final question about the Chinese AI regulatory approach and how that's affecting things. I don't think it's controversial to say a lot of the U.S. approach here is based on nationalism and racism. The competition with China is, countries have always competed a bit with each other when it comes to trying to establish dominance in different fields. This is a different thing. This is a very personal, concentrated attack, and it is going along racial lines in many cases, which is also consistent with the approach of this administration in a lot of areas. I don't know how much the general public supports the us versus China view of things, other than there are people that get very brainwashed into like, if we don't beat China in the AI race, then we're all going to live under communism, which is terrible. And it's this very big cultural mess. But I also think that the way that the Trump administration has approached regulation, despite people overwhelmingly wanting regulation and protections on AI, has made him so unpopular that trying to stir up the us versus them sentiment to get more popularity just is not working anymore. I don't know if that means that people will start being better about their attitudes when it comes to nationalism and racism in general, but I do know that that is a strategy that does not seem to be working for him anymore.
Firstly, on the UK point, I think, as you'll know, Helena, it will depend a lot on the next election. And I think if there's an overwhelming support for reform, then there will be a closer direction to US approaches. And if there is not, then I think it's not that we'll be closer to the EU, it's just that we'll drift in parallel more. We still have EU law on the books. The courts have been showing a strong willingness to pay close attention to and informally align with CJEU judgments from after the Brexit day. So the courts want to have that continued dialogue, and where the CJEU says sensible things, which is not all the time. And so I think that will be the case. Now, in relation to China, I think I have there's a different point I wanted to raise in relation to this, which I think we don't talk very much about Chinese AI regulation. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening there. And it responds to different policy challenges from Europe that I think will come on the European agenda soon. In particular, China's been much more active at responding to scams. The deep synthesis rules and the previous iterations of them are really interesting and are sort of the world's most well-developed watermarking and deep synthesis rules, far ahead of the EU's in many ways. They have their own problems. The actual nature of what's embedded, I think, can be quite problematic. But in terms of the thinking about through the supply chain, the mobilizing to stop content which is really harmful to people, like scams and deepfakes and all these kind of things that are occurring, is something that I think is going to come for Europe. Now, and partly it will come for Europe because there's some of it's organized by extraterritorial Chinese organized crime who are living in Cambodia and similar, and the general direction is please stop targeting Chinese people, and maybe we'll continue. And they're differently teaching the world about these tools. But certainly, I feel like what we have in the narrative as well is a narrative that US is deregulating, Europe's got more regulation, and then people don't really know what to think about China here. And the answer is China is doing a lot of regulation. When I was in Beijing recently, a leading scholar of AI law that I was talking to said that she had to actually stop the party just copy-pasting the AI Act into the law, because that's what they wanted to do, because it was the easiest thing. And they thought, well, Europe's already done some thinking on this. And they were like, well, we're Chinese scholars. We can think of our own way to develop interesting law here. And we have our own national interests and own national needs. And so the narrative is a lot more complicated. And of course, it's different for censorship and freedom of expression and those issues. But in terms of private companies doing privacy, there's a lot of interesting stuff. In terms of IP, the Beijing Internet Court is way ahead in terms of analyzing the technical details of models. And it's really, I think we should do some more learning about all societies are going to have to tackle the complex challenges from AI. And we don't all have the same political arrangements. But the challenges aren't so different. And mechanisms we can learn from each other. And I think that's the sad thing about a sort of a xenophobic approach, is that regardless of the quality of rule of law or legal system and fundamental rights in a regime, it is a problem-solving regime. And actually, China is quite a good problem-solving regime in many regulatory areas. And Europe is often not in some areas as well. So we should be learning more.
In the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to some more questions, but thank you so much for those responses. Maybe over there.
Thanks so much. That's the panel that we needed in order to close the CPDP. very much needed. Something that I cannot stop thinking about when it comes to this deregulatory wave is also how civil society, how the European Union seems to be learning about how the US regime is treating civil society, right? When it comes to our role in the omnibus, not just the digital omnibus, but all of the digital omnibus, but also when it comes to this post-truth era that I think also the European Union is entering. All of everything that we're seeing from the omnibus and from the deregulatory agenda is not based on evidence, or not an evidence that we've seen, because we keep being told we have extensive evidence-based research. It's like, yeah, show me the money and do an impact assessment, and we haven't seen that. And all of it speaks about how people's rights are just an afterthought at best, right? And this is something that I fear Brussels is learning also from Washington, or from the current state in Washington, D.C. So would you care to comment on that? This question is for all of us. And again, thanks so much for organizing that.
I can very briefly say that the status of how the federal government is approaching civil society in the US has shifted in a couple ways. Number one, we're just not invited to conversations anymore that we used to be part of. They used to at least pretend that they were consulting with civil society. They don't even pretend anymore. And on the very rare occasion where they have like a civil society representative in the room, often it is someone that is from an organization that is not civil society, that is like a trade agreement or a trade group that represents businesses and not civil society. So we are almost never involved in those discussions anymore. The other thing is that many civil society organizations, not all, like very thankfully, EPIC never had funding from the federal government, but there was a very large purse of federal government grants that used to go to civil society, and all of those were cut in the Trump administration. So a lot of civil society is really deeply struggling with funding right now and staying viable.
Happy to take that. Yeah, I think the attack on civil society does not come from the US, but it is homemade as well. I mean, the last European elections and the election cycles was basically won by conservative parties, so EPP for the insiders of the European Parliament, Christian Democrat parties. And there's a very strong push from those parties and from businesses to go against civil society because it was perceived as extremely powerful in shaping the narrative on climate policy and the Green Deal. Not so much on tech, actually, but really on the Green Deal that not all, but some powerful businesses hate. So I think the push comes more from like the fossil industry lobby, that kind of area, and some companies that have trouble complying with everything entailed by the Green Deal. So I think this is where this comes from. And then obviously there's sort of a natural alliance with far-right forces. And what we are seeing is this hard attack on civil society within the European Parliament, going after the life funding for a lot of organizations. In Germany, there was a big, like what we would call a written question in the Parliament, but it's a bigger thing in the Bundestag. Having organizations listed that get public funding and really going against civil society, also in the defense of democracy, a little bit all areas, not so much tech actually, but more democracy, civil participation, climate, social, that whole area. And that is still quite powerful. And it's really an attack on the reputation of a civil society organization as such. So they keep saying, well, they get the money from the European Commission, so they just advance the European Commission's agenda, as if the European Commission agenda still aligned with that of civil society, which is absolutely not the case. What I do see, what they do copy from the US is the playbook on how to do that. So sort of the Jim Jordan, Mike Pence kind of playbook. Yeah, we analyzed that. And
So sorry.
yeah, if anybody's interested, we have documents. Just write to me. We did something with the Green Group. I don't want to make, advertising for my political group, but we really did some work around that. We're happy to share the documents. It's really a flyer that's easy to use for civil society to show how does it work, how was like the electoral integrity partnership at Stanford taken down. It's always the same playbook, and they use the same playbook to take the LIFE organization, go against the funding of civil society. So you start with some obscure website talking about post-truth, and then it jumps to a little bit more serious websites, and then everybody copies it and jumps into far-right press, and then into the regular press, and then you get parliamentary interrogations, and then you set up a committee or a working group. And it's exactly the same thing how it happened in the US now. They did it here in this mandate. It's really the same thing. So I think that the attack on civil society is home ground, but the weapons that are using, this is something they have really been learning from the US. And I mean, Jim Jordan has traveled to Brussels repeatedly. His team is around. They're teaching the far-right groups how to do that. And there's really a lot of, on tech, the cooperation is, for example, when they did these, the Justice Committee, was it called Justice Committee? Yeah. In the House, who did these documents on how the DSA is supposed to be censorship. So the far right, every time in committee, stands up and say, we want to invite these people to present the document because this is censorship and so on. So there's really very, very close cooperation. And yeah, that's really a problem.
Yeah, just to add on the sort of shrinking space of civil society, I mean, that's a kind of a very broad area, but I think, I think I agree that that is not necessarily simply coming from the US, and the EU plays a role in some of the also some of the kind of legislation that they put forward. I mean, we're expecting to see legislation, for example, around data retention, which we don't know yet what it's going to look like, but sort of supporting a sort of a surveillance type of agenda, which affects civil society greatly. And then obviously the role of member states, which if you look around the situation of repression of civil society and dissent is growing, and it's actually growing by using some of the surveillance technologies that one would expect will be much more regulated or banned at EU level. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we can do some closing remarks. We have one here and one over there.
Thank you all. Maria, you promised a good panel for the end of Friday, and I think you delivered, so thank you very much for this. Much like Michael, I suffer from the affliction of being British, but I escaped 10 years ago to come to Europe, and I think the US has been in the conversation ever since then because certain traumatic things happened in 2016, and we've kind of rolled with it since then, and especially in the last 2 years in Brussels, we've had a lot more discussions about our relations with the US. Whether it's for work, 'cause I work on the omnibus with my colleagues here, or whether it's with friends about defense and trade and all the rest of it. So I think it's a huge topic and lots of different bits to unpick. But if you were to have, and this is for everyone, 5 minutes in a room with, let's say, Ursula von der Leyen, or Michael for yourself with Keir Starmer, or maybe Andy Burnham in a few weeks, who knows? What would be your one bit of advice for them on how to handle these relations with the US and how to make sure that we actually have a healthy relationship and not what we have right now, which is being bullied? Thank you.
I think we'll collect both questions and then have the panelists go and answer as they can.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a very interesting panel. Ursula Pachel from NOIB. I have a question which is, I guess, mainly directed to Alexandra, which is about the EU's resilience, I mean, the resilience of the lawmaking process and maybe even of the enforcement, which has been so radically reformed, so to speak, with giving exclusive power to the European Commission in the DSA and the DMA, etc., and also partially on the AI Act. Because what we see now is that the main vehicle that the European Commission is using for doing the simplification or deregulation is these omnibuses, right? And in the case of the digital omnibus, which is number 7, I think, we see that even though they go deeply into changing fundamental rights, limiting the essence of rights that are directly endorsed or enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, there is not even any trace of a proportionality assessment, which would be obligatory if you do that as a lawmaker. And my question is really, how can the European Union lawmaking process defend the respective roles? Because the Commission has a very strong right of initiative, but it doesn't work if they do things that are like experimental, right? Because they have no evidence, they don't do impact assessment, they do not do fundamental rights changes that are properly assessed in their proportionality. And the only kind of safeguard is then the European Court of Justice years later which also produces a lot of legal uncertainty, if at all it would come to that. So my question is, could we not have a framework in place for what omnibuses should look like, what criteria they have to meet? They can only be used for technical stuff, really technical stuff, but not for substantive changes. Is that a discussion that I don't see so far, but maybe it should be necessary? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had one more question up here, if you still want to ask that, and then we can kind of speed through these. Black shirt. Yes.
Hi, I'm Toon de Hane from K11, PhD candidate. My question is mainly towards Kali or maybe Maria. So you talked about measures with broad bipartisan support, such as social media and Health for Kids. Another such measures is repealing Citizens United. I was wondering if you could comment on that, if you think it has a chance to happen, the repeal. What impact would it have? Does it rank high on the priorities of EPIC to work towards such a future? Yeah, that's basically my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a range of questions here on advice on how to cultivate a healthier relationship between these international bodies. One on what a framework and what an omnibus really should look like going forward, what kinds of limitations maybe should be put into place, and then a final one on Citizens United, which I think I can take really quickly. And I don't think it's going to get repealed with our current Supreme Court. I think, unfortunately, the power that has been given to corporations and speech has really led to a lot of the litigation that we're seeing right now and the power of these tech lobbyists to have direct contact with politicians. So, unfortunately, I don't think it's on the chopping block. And EPIC has a lot of fights to fight, but unfortunately, I don't think that's one of them right now. Maybe we can go down the line. Yeah, Sandra?
Yeah. Maybe on the EU resilience of the lawmaking process. I have to say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a politician, and politics is about power. So in the moment where there's one party family that has power in most European states and in the European Commission, and that can easily build a majority with the far right, it's very hard to go back to procedure. I think politics, you win when you win the narrative, when you have the narrative that strikes a nerve that the public supports, and when you know the story you tell, when that wins, you also get everything that is downstream. And for a long time, the story was rule of law, procedure, and so on. And they went against that story. You know, the whole deregulation thing we started with, it's not only about rules, it's about the whole idea that there are fundamental things in a society, like fundamental rights, like the principle of rule of law, that are dispensable, that they depend on political majorities. So to go back to saying, well, procedure is important, I think you need a very compelling argument around how democracy benefits the people, and you need to win the political power back. That's maybe not what you want to hear if you are a lawyer, but that is what my belief is as a politician. You have to make this compelling argument. People have better quality of life in Europe. We have better health. We have better income, even if the GDP doesn't say that, which is what the American ambassador keeps saying. You know, your GDP, Germany's GDP is worse than in West Virginia per capita. Yeah, but we don't spend $2,000 a month on healthcare, frankly, you know, or $8 for an egg. So yeah, I mean, I go to the US a lot. It's just, prices are just completely crazy.
And she's right.
So you have to have a compelling narrative and win elections, and then you can go back saying, you know, the rules-based multilateral order is important, and a good process around lawmaking is important, but you have to win that political power and the political narrative first, and this is what we have lost. On the von der Leyen question, if I may, a bunch of different things. One thing is never give in to a bully and never give in to a blackmailer, but it will always get worse. You know, if you have blackmail, the first thing that every organization tells you, don't give in, don't start paying them. And this is exactly what everybody did with Trump. They started literally paying him, you know, literally in the US. And if Ursula von der Leyen had taken the telephone and called Mark Carney, Antonio Albanese, Modi, and all these people and said, you know, we're not giving in this tariff thing. We will all stand up and say there, you know, we are, I don't know how many continents with big markets, 3 billion people. We are not changing the tariff system. What would the UF have done? You know, this was the thing to do, you know, the Mark Carney speech at Davos. This is what everybody should have, and this would have been von der Leyen's job as the head of the European Union to do that when Trump was first elected. Say, hi, congrats for your elections. And by the way, you know, we all agree, we like the trade system we have and everybody benefits. We can do small adjustments, but we're not going to pay tariffs, full stop. That would have been the thing to do. And this is also true for everything else. You know, if they had stood up with the tariffs, I think it would have been so much easier. And the third thing I think is to say, what are the strengths of the European Union? We still have a big internal market where people still can afford stuff. The tech companies, apart from X, are very interested. You know, Meta is super interested in having access to our market. And building the same narrative with Canada, with Australia. India might be a little bit more complicated, but on some things we align, on others a little bit less. I think that would have been very, very, very powerful. Right now, I think it's building more a connection also to other political players in the US. You know, it's very clear when you go to the US that the Trump is already, it's sort of over. I mean, he's still in power, but everybody's looking what's going to happen after the midterms. So connect to the people who might be in power, at least in Congress, and other forces, whereas public sentiment, you know, what I said, you know, 7 out of 10 Americans being against AI, that's an interesting data point, I think, that we might want to tell these tech companies. So, you know, politics is not only about brutal force, it's about the power of narrative. And this is something the US, that kind of reputation that the US have lost and the EU is losing, going, but we could still recover right now doing the right thing.
I do think we're over time. I think, no, this is an incredible place to end. I think you have been very well spoken and a very like poignant piece to think about of just not giving in and like really holding the line and like staying true to like what you have spent years and years legislating. So I think that was a good place. If there are any extremely brief last minute remarks that you want to add on, please go ahead. But if not, we'll let these lovely people go from the place that we've been holding them forever. Please escape and please enjoy the rest of your Friday evening and your weekend. Thank you so much, guys.